A woman's grit isn't measured by what she has. It's measured by what she'll do when she has nothing left to lose. For Josephine Mayhew, that moment came on a Tuesday, a blistering, soul-baking Tuesday in the heart of Montana territory. She was a widow with a baby on the way and a ranch that was turning to dust right under her feet. In the center of her small town, a man was being sold. Not a slave. Something worse. A broken soldier, battered by war and left for dead, now being auctioned off to the highest bidder for 6 months of hard labor. The price for what was left of his life was a single silver dollar. In a desperate last-ditch gamble to survive, Josephine paid it. She bought herself a farmhand, a ghost. But hours later, back at her isolated homestead, as she cleaned the grime and blood from his face, he opened his eyes. And the very first word he spoke was her name. How could this stranger, this man she'd purchased for a pittance, possibly know who she was? The answer would unravel her life. It would expose the lies her dead husband was buried with. And it would bring a hellstorm of violence and vengeance right to her doorstep, a storm that wouldn't stop until it had taken everything. The heat in Redemption Gulch, Montana, had a physical weight in August of 1878. It pressed down on the plank sidewalks and shimmered above the dusty main street. It baked the very will out of a man. For Josephine Mayhew, it felt like a blanket woven from her own grief, heavy and suffocating. She stood in the thin shade of the general store's overhang. One hand rested on the swell of her belly. The other clutched a small, sweat-dampened coin purse. 6 months a widow, 7 months with child, and a lifetime of uncertainty stretching before her like the endless, sun-scorched plains. Her husband, Frank, had been a good man, strong, quiet, capable. The official story, the one Sheriff Brody had delivered with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, was a cattle stampede, a freak accident. He'd been crushed trying to turn the herd. But the ranch, their dream, was now her nightmare. The fences were down, the cattle were scattered, and the lone hired hand she'd kept on had stolen 2 of her best horses and vanished last week. She was alone. That's why she was here, listening to the grim spectacle unfolding in front of the sheriff's office. It wasn't a formal slave auction. Such things were a horror of the past. This was a cruel permutation of Western pragmatism. It was a vagrancy sale. The town council had decreed that any able-bodied man without means of support could be indentured to the highest bidder for 6 months to pay off his debt to society. A debt which usually consisted of public drunkenness or just being a stranger in the wrong place at the wrong time. Today's offering was a pitiful sight. He was slumped on a wooden crate, head bowed, his lank dark hair matted with grime and blood. His clothes, once the blue of a Union soldier, were shredded and stained. A crudely bandaged wound on his left shoulder seeped a dark, angry red. His face, when he briefly lifted it, was a geography of pain. A bruised jaw, a split lip, and eyes so hollow they seemed to have swallowed the sky. "All right, folks, let's get this done. It's too hot for sermonizing," Sheriff Brody called out, his voice as dry as the dirt. Brody was a man carved from oak, weathered and hard, and he clearly took no pleasure in this. This man was found 3 days ago collapsed near Flat Willow Creek. No name, no horse, no papers. He's been a guest of the county, and now it's time he earned his keep. 6 months' labor. What am I bid for this fine specimen? A few cynical chuckles rippled through the small crowd. "I'll bid a nickel for the buzzards to have him," shouted a miner named Peterson from the saloon steps. "He's half dead, Brody," another called. "You'd be paying someone to bury him." Josephine felt a strange pang. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a flicker of recognition, not of the man himself, but of his state. He was at the absolute bottom, a place she felt herself sliding toward with every passing day. Her ranch needed hands, strong ones. This man was a wreck, but he was built solid beneath the filth and injury. He had a soldier's frame, if he could be mended. 25 cents, a voice rasped. It was Mr. Abernathy, the miserly blacksmith, a man known for working his apprentices into early graves. The soldier on the crate didn't react. He just stared at the dust between his worn-out boots, as if he'd already left his body behind. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. Abernathy would break him. He'd work the man until that shoulder wound turned septic and then dump the body in an unmarked hole. Her own desperation was a wild animal clawing inside her. Hiring a proper hand would cost $20 a month she simply didn't have. This, this was a gamble on a biblical scale. 50 cents, she called out, her voice surprisingly firm. Heads turned. The crowd murmured. Josephine Mayhew, the grieving widow, bidding on a vagrant. Abernathy shot her a venomous look, his beady eyes narrowing. 75, he snapped. The world seemed to shrink to the space between her, the blacksmith, and the broken man on the crate. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the whispers. What's she thinking? Poor Frank's not even cold in the ground. Frank. He would have hated this. He would have hired 2 men and paid them fairly. But Frank was gone, and his ideals were buried with him. She opened her coin purse. Inside lay a single gleaming silver dollar, 2 quarters, and a dime. It was all she had until she could sell off the few remaining yearlings. It was grocery money. It was everything. $1, Josephine said, the words tasting like ash. A hush fell over the crowd. $1 was an absurdly high bid. It was the price of a decent meal and a bottle of whiskey, not a broken-down drifter. Abernathy scoffed, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and shook his head, turning back toward his forge. He wouldn't be played for a fool. Sheriff Brody looked at Josephine, his expression unreadable. $1 it is, sold to the widow Mayhew for $1 silver. He banged a small gavel on the hitching post. He's your problem now, ma'am. Josephine stepped forward, ignoring the stares, and handed the silver dollar to the sheriff. The metal was cool in his palm, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat. She then turned to the man she had just bought. Can you walk? She asked, her voice softer now. He lifted his head slowly. For the first time, his eyes met hers. They weren't just hollow. There was a flicker of something in their depths, a banked ember of intelligence, of shock. He gave a short, jerky nod. The journey to the Mayhew ranch was a slow, torturous affair. Josephine led her old mare, Bess, while the man stumbled along behind, his hand gripping the saddle leather for support. He didn't speak a single word. The 3 miles felt like 30. The silence was broken only by the buzzing of flies, the creak of the saddle, and his ragged, painful breaths. When they finally crested the rise that overlooked her property, Josephine saw it through his eyes. The main house, a sturdy log cabin Frank had built with his own hands, looked solid enough, but the barn door hung from one hinge. A section of fence lay, trampled and broken. The fields were thirsty for water. It was a portrait of slow decay. She settled him in the small bunkhouse, a rough-hewn shed a dozen yards from the main cabin. It was stark, containing only a cot, a small table, and a wash basin. It smelled of dust and disuse. Lie down, she commanded, her tone all business. She was a landowner, and he was her property for the next 6 months. There was no room for sentiment. He obeyed without a word, collapsing onto the cot with a groan of pain that he tried and failed to suppress. For the next 2 days, Josephine became a nurse. She fetched water, tore up old sheets for bandages, and cleaned his wound with whiskey, an act that cost her dearly in more ways than one. He thrashed in a feverish delirium, muttering disjointed words and names that meant nothing to her. Corrigan, the pass, Find Finn, the gold. It was the rambling of a mind scorched by fever and memory. She spoon-fed him broth she could barely afford to make, her jaw set with determination. This was an investment. If he died, her dollar and her last hope died with him. She saw the scars that littered his body, an old puckered mark on his thigh that looked like a bullet wound, a long, jagged line across his ribs from a knife or a bayonet. This man had walked through hell long before he'd collapsed by Flat Willow Creek. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. His breathing was even, his skin cool to the touch. She brought in a bowl of warm water, a bar of soap, and Frank's old straight razor. She couldn't stand the grime a moment longer. "Can you sit up?" she asked. He pushed himself up, his movements slow but deliberate. His eyes were clear now. watchful. He said nothing as she lathered his face, the intimacy of the act hanging thick and awkward in the air. Her knuckles brushed his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble, but underneath the bone structure was strong. With the razor, she carefully scraped away the weeks of filth and neglect. A new face emerged, gaunt but younger than she'd thought. A square jaw, a firm mouth, a faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow. When she was done, she wiped his face with a damp cloth. He looked like a different person, not just a vagrant, but a man. He raised a hand and touched his clean-shaven jaw, as if rediscovering himself. His gaze lifted and met hers. The hollowness was gone, replaced by an unnerving intensity. He studied her face, his brow furrowed in a way that made her suddenly, inexplicably nervous. It wasn't the look of a grateful servant or a broken drifter. It was a look of profound, earth-shattering recognition. She took a half-step back, clutching the small metal bowl to her chest like a shield. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Then his voice, raspy from disuse but clear and steady, cut through the quiet air of the bunkhouse. Josephine. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He said her name as if he had known it his entire life. Josephine froze. The bowl slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor, splashing water across the dusty planks. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Her blood ran cold. The air fled her lungs. Every hair on her arm stood on end. She stared at the man she had bought for $1, a complete stranger, a ghost from the side of the road. And he knew her name. 1,000 thoughts, sharp and panicked, tore through Josephine's mind. Who was he? How could he possibly know her? Redemption Gulch was a small community, but she had kept to herself, especially since Frank's death. No one outside the town knew her name, and this man hadn't been in town long enough to learn anything. Her first instinct was fear. Raw, primal fear. Was he a madman? Some phantom her grief had conjured? Or something far more dangerous? Her hand instinctively went to her swollen belly. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, her voice a harsh whisper. She backed away toward the door of the bunkhouse, her eyes never leaving his. The man on the cot, the dollar man, watched her retreat with a pained expression. He seemed to understand her terror, and it looked like it was wounding him more than the festering gash on his shoulder. "Please," he said, his voice rough. He tried to push himself up further, but winced, his hand going to his bandaged wound. "Don't be afraid." He paused, his eyes pleading. "My name is Wyatt. Wyatt Cole." The name meant nothing to her. "That doesn't answer my question." Wyatt Cole took a slow, steadying breath. His gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, as if gathering the strength to excavate a long-buried truth. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with a sorrow so profound it momentarily eclipsed her fear. "I know your name, Josephine," he said slowly, deliberately, "because I knew your husband." The world tilted on its axis. "You knew Frank." The idea was preposterous. Frank had been a simple man from Missouri. He'd never spoken of a Wyatt Cole. He had no friends to speak of from before their life together, a fact she'd once found romantic, as if his life had only truly begun with her. "I knew him," Wyatt repeated, his voice laced with a grim finality. "But the man you married, he wasn't named Frank Mayhew." Josephine felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine, chilling her to the bone despite the oppressive heat. "What are you talking about? Of course that was his name." Wyatt shook his head, a slow, mournful motion. "His name was Franklin O'Malley. Most folks just called him Finn." Franklin O'Malley, Finn. The name was alien, a foreign sound that had no place in the sanctuary of her memories. And yet, find Finn. The feverish mutterings she dismissed as nonsense suddenly echoed in her mind with terrifying clarity. "You're lying," she said, but the words lacked conviction. A seed of doubt, poisonous and potent, had been planted. "You're a fever-addled drifter talking nonsense." "I wish I were," Wyatt said. "God, I wish I were. Finn and I, we rode together for a long time." "Rode where?" Josephine pressed, her voice trembling. "He was a rancher. He bought this land with money his father left him." Wyatt's laugh was a short, bitter bark of sound that held no humor. His father was a penniless drunk in St. Louis who died of a cough. The money, the money wasn't from an inheritance. He locked his gaze on hers, his expression bleak. We were part of the Corrigan gang. We robbed a Union Pacific payroll train outside of Cheyenne 2 years ago. It was the biggest score we ever made. Over $50,000 in gold coin. The air in the bunkhouse grew thick, unbreathable. Corrigan, another name from his delirium. Josephine felt dizzy, leaning against the doorframe for support. The man she had loved, the father of her unborn child, a train robber, an outlaw. It was impossible. It was a violation of every memory she held dear. Frank was a good man, she whispered, the words a desperate prayer. He wanted to be, Wyatt conceded, his voice softening with a surprising gentleness. That's why he ran. After the robbery, we were supposed to lay low, meet up in 6 months and split the gold. But Finn, he was smarter than the rest of us. He took the largest share, more than he was due, and he just disappeared. Wyatt's words painted a picture she couldn't bear to look at. Changed his name, came out here to Montana, and reinvented himself as Frank Mayhew. He bought this land and he found you. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture of a life built on lies. Frank's reticence about his past, his lack of family, the way he sometimes startled at the sound of a distant rider. She had attributed it all to a quiet, solitary nature. Now it looked like fear, the constant fear of being found. If this is true, she managed to say, her throat tight, then who are you? One of his outlaw friends come to, what? Get his share? The fear returned, sharp and acidic. Was she harboring a viper? I was, Wyatt admitted, shame coloring his features. But I left that life behind too. Not as cleanly as Finn did. I spent the last year trying to go straight, working odd jobs, drifting. But Bartholomew Corrigan, the leader of our old outfit, he isn't the forgiving type. He doesn't forget a debt. A new, more immediate terror began to dawn on her. He spent 2 years hunting for Finn. Wyatt's voice dropped lower. And a few weeks ago, he found him. Josephine's heart stopped. What do you mean? The stampede? Wyatt's eyes were full of pity, and it was the pity that broke her. There was no stampede, Josephine. A wave of nausea washed over her. She gripped the rough wood of the doorframe, her knuckles white. Corrigan and his men have found out where Finn was hiding. I heard they were closing in, so I rode out here. I don't know why. Maybe to warn him. Maybe I thought I could reason with Corrigan. I was a fool. He paused, the memory clearly agonizing. I was too late. I found them down in the south pasture. It wasn't a stampede. It was a confrontation, an execution. Sheriff Brody's words came back to her. A freak accident. Crushed trying to turn the herd. A lie. A convenient story to close a case. To spare a pregnant widow the horrifying truth. The town must have known, or at least suspected. They had protected her from a truth they thought she couldn't handle. They shot him, Wyatt continued, his voice flat and dead. He didn't go down easy, I'll give him that. He took one of them, a man named Jesse, with him. In the fighting, I got this. He gestured to his shoulder. I managed to get away, but my horse was shot out from under me. I've been wandering on foot ever since, until I collapsed at the creek. Corrigan thinks I'm dead. He thinks everyone who knew about the gold is dead, except for him. Josephine stared at him, at this man named Wyatt Cole, the harbinger of her life's demolition. Her grief for Frank was suddenly twisted into a horrifying knot of betrayal and anger. The man she had mourned didn't even exist. He was a fiction, a character played by a thief named Finn O'Malley. Their life together, their love, the very foundation of her world was built on stolen gold and a lie. The money, she said, the words cold and hard as river stones. The gold. Where is it? That's the question, isn't it? Wyatt said. That's the question Corrigan is asking. Finn must have hidden it somewhere, here on this ranch. He was living a quiet life, but he'd never be far from his nest egg. Suddenly, the danger was no longer a ghost from the past. It was a living, breathing threat. Bartholomew Corrigan, a man who had hunted Finn for 2 years, a man who had murdered him in cold blood. "He'll think I know where it is," Josephine breathed, the realization dawning with icy certainty. "He will," Wyatt confirmed. "Once he's sure the trail has gone cold, once he's certain no one is looking for him, he'll be back. He won't leave $50,000 buried in the dirt. He'll come back for the gold, and he'll tear this place apart, and you with it, to find it." She looked around at the ranch, at the broken fences and thirsty fields. It wasn't just a failing property anymore. It was a target. It was a tomb waiting for its next occupant. And she was trapped in the middle of it, pregnant, alone, with a wounded ex-outlaw in her bunkhouse, who was the only living soul who knew the truth. Her entire world had been a lie, and the truth, she now realized, was going to get her killed. She looked at Wyatt Cole, the man she'd bought for a single silver dollar. He wasn't her servant. He wasn't her enemy. He was something else entirely, a ghost of her husband's treacherous past, and terrifyingly, her only possible protector from the storm that was coming. The days that followed Wyatt's revelation were thick with a new kind of silence. The old silence had been one of grief. This one was taut with secrets and the constant humming dread of a coming storm. Josephine found herself watching the horizon, scrutinizing every dust devil and distant rider, her heart seizing with fear each time. The world that had once felt lonely but safe now felt predatory. Her relationship with Wyatt shifted. He was no longer the dollar man or a faceless patient. He was a man with a name and a history inextricably, tragically tied to her own. She still brought him food and tended to his wound, but now their interactions were fraught with a tense, unspoken partnership. He was a living, breathing link to the man she had loved, and the stranger he had actually been. "Did you love him?" Wyatt asked one evening. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, strong enough now to move around the small bunkhouse. His shoulder was healing, the angry red fading to a bruised purple. Josephine was standing in the doorway, a tray with a plate of beans and jerky in her hands. The question caught her off guard. "I loved Frank Mayhew," she answered carefully. "The man who built this house, who was gentle with the horses, who promised me a future. I don't know if I knew Finn O'Malley." Wyatt nodded, accepting the distinction. "He loved you. I could see it. When Corrigan's men cornered him, he wasn't trying to run. He was fighting to protect this place. To protect you." The words should have been a comfort, but they only sharpened the pain of the betrayal. He had died protecting a lie. As Wyatt regained his strength, a grim purpose settled over them. They had to find the gold, not for the wealth it represented, but as a weapon. It was the only thing that could save them. If they could find it, perhaps they could use it as a bargaining chip, or simply flee with it before Corrigan returned. He was a creature of habit, but also paranoid, Wyatt said, trying to get inside Finn's head. He wouldn't have just buried it in a box. It would be somewhere clever, somewhere he could get to it, but no one else would stumble upon. They began a systematic search of the ranch. It was a strange, almost surreal activity. By day, Josephine would do her chores, mending what she could, tending to her small vegetable garden, her mind 1,000 miles away. Wyatt, his arm in a sling she'd fashioned from a strip of canvas, would walk the property, his eyes scanning, searching, trying to remember any hint Finn might have dropped in their old life. They started in the house. They checked for loose floorboards, for hollow spots in the walls, for false backs in the cupboards Frank, she still couldn't bring herself to think of him as Finn, had built. They found nothing but dust and memories that now felt tainted. In Frank's few personal possessions, they found a small, worn Bible. Josephine had looked through it 100 times since his death, finding no solace in its pages. Wyatt, however, approached it with a different eye. "Men like us," he said, quietly flipping through the thin pages. "Sometimes we use these not for prayer, but for code." His fingers, surprisingly nimble for a man of his rough past, traced the verses. He scanned for marks, for underlinings, for anything out of place. On a page in the book of Job, a passage about treasures in dark places, he found it. A tiny, almost invisible pinprick above a single letter in a single word. Then another a few pages later, and another. It took them 2 nights, their heads bent together over the small table in the main cabin. the lantern light casting long dancing shadows on the walls. It was a painstaking process of cross-referencing the pin-pricked letters. Slowly, painstakingly, a message emerged. Under the Arastra. Josephine looked at him, confused. The what? An Arastra, Wyatt explained, a flicker of excitement in his eyes. It's a simple ore-crushing mill. A big flat stone with another heavy stone dragged over it by a mule to crush rock and separate out the gold. There's no gold on this land, Josephine stated. Frank prospected for months when we first got here. He said it was barren. Exactly, Wyatt said, the idea taking shape. He would have built one as a decoy, a piece of abandoned prospecting equipment nobody would look at twice. He'd claim he built it and gave up. But really, he built it to hide the gold underneath it. The next morning they found it. A quarter-mile from the house, half hidden in a thicket of scrub brush and rock, was a crude circular pit lined with flat stones. In the center was a pivot post, and lying nearby was a heavy dragstone. It looked ancient, forgotten, a testament to some long-dead prospector's failed dream. It was exactly as Wyatt had described. The base stone was massive, a solid slab of granite that must have weighed half a ton. It was impossible for the two of them to move. Despair began to creep in. The gold was within their grasp, but completely inaccessible. We need leverage, Wyatt said, his jaw set. He looked around, his soldier's mind assessing the terrain and resources. He pointed toward the barn. The block and tackle from the hayloft, and we need an anchor. They spent the rest of the day rigging a complex system of ropes and pulleys, using a deeply rooted old cottonwood tree as their anchor. It was backbreaking work. Josephine, despite her pregnancy, worked alongside him, her determination overriding her body's protests. She hauled rope, positioned logs for fulcrums, and followed Wyatt's sharp, precise commands. In those hours of shared toil, she saw the man he was now, not the outlaw he had been. He was focused, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her, constantly telling her to rest, to let him handle the heavier parts. A strange bond was being forged between them, a partnership born of desperation and mutual respect. As the sun began to dip below the western mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red, they were ready. Wyatt took the strain on the main rope, his muscles cording, his face a mask of effort. Josephine worked a smaller guide rope, keeping the tension even. Now, Wyatt grunted, slowly, agonizingly, with the shriek of protesting rope and groaning wood. The massive granite slab began to move. It scraped across the dirt, inch by painful inch, until it had cleared the stone pit. They both stood, breathing heavily, and stared into the hole. There, nestled in a hollowed-out space beneath where the stone had been, was a heavy, iron-bound chest. It wasn't a moment of triumph. Looking at the chest, Josephine felt a profound wave of sickness. This was it, the source of her husband's lie, the reason for his death, and the magnet that was drawing a killer toward her home. Wyatt jumped down into the pit and with a grunt, lifted the chest out. It was incredibly heavy. He found the lock rusted but unsecured. Using the claw end of a hammer, he pried the lid open. The last rays of the setting sun struck the contents, and the chest exploded with a dull, buttery gleam. It was filled to the brim with gold coins, double eagles mostly, a fortune that could buy a dozen ranches, a life of ease and security. They stared at it, mesmerized. It was the stuff of legend, the kind of treasure men killed and died for. And it was theirs. The spell was broken by a sound, a single sharp crack, like a dry branch snapping. Wyatt's head shot up, his body instantly rigid. He grabbed Josephine's arm and pulled her down behind the displaced Arastra stone, his hand clamping over her mouth. "Don't move," he breathed, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. Then they saw it. On the ridge overlooking the ranch, the same ridge she and Wyatt had crested just days ago, was the silhouette of a lone rider. He was sitting motionless on his horse, a dark shape against the dying light, looking down at the small cabin in the barn. He was too far away to make out any features, but they didn't need to. They both knew who it was. The vulture had returned to the carcass. Bartholomew Corrigan had come back for his gold. The silhouette on the ridge was a statue of pure menace. It remained for a long minute, a silent proclamation of ownership, before melting back into the twilight. But the threat lingered, thick and suffocating. Corrigan was here. He wasn't just a ghost story Wyatt told anymore. He was a physical presence, watching them. "Get the chest back to the house. Now," Wyatt ordered, his voice low and urgent. All traces of the quiet, recovering patient were gone. In his place was the soldier, the survivor. "He might not have seen us, but he'll be coming down soon. He won't wait long." Together they wrestled the heavy chest back toward the cabin. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of a distant owl sounded like an approaching footstep. The gold, which had seemed like a solution moments before, now felt like a lead weight dragging them to the bottom of a river. Inside the cabin, they barred the door and shuttered the windows. The small, familiar space transformed into a fortress, a cage. Josephine's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of terror. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice shaking only slightly. She refused to crumble. She had her unborn child to think of. Wyatt was already moving, his mind working with tactical speed. He checked the load in the old rifle Frank kept above the mantelpiece. He laid out the box of cartridges on the table. "He won't come alone. He'll have his men. My guess is 2, maybe 3. He likes to have numbers on his side." He looked at Josephine, his gaze direct and serious. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, nodding to Frank's revolver, which lay on a nearby shelf. "Frank showed me once," she said. "I'm a fair shot with the rifle, at a distance. Never liked the handgun." "There won't be any distance," Wyatt said grimly. "They'll come right to the door. Aim for the center of the man, and don't stop pulling the trigger until he's down." He handed her the heavy Colt. Its weight was cold and final in her hands. They didn't have to wait long. The moon had just begun to climb, casting a pale, spectral light over the ranch, when the dogs from the neighboring property started barking hysterically. Then silence. A silence that was far more terrifying than the noise. Wyatt blew out the main lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the shutters. He took up a position near the front window, peeling back a tiny corner of the shutter to watch. Josephine stood near the back wall, the revolver clutched in both hands, her back pressed against the rough-hewn logs. The baby chose that moment to kick, a sudden, sharp jab that made her gasp, a reminder of what was at stake. Then they heard it, the soft crunch of boots on the dry ground. More than one set. They were moving with a practiced stealth that spoke of long, bloody experience. A voice called out from the darkness, a voice that was deceptively pleasant, almost cultured. "Finn O'Malley, I know you're in there, or what's left of you. Don't think I'm a fool. I know you had a woman. Send her out with my gold and I'll let her walk away. A man of my word, Finn. You always knew that." It was Bartholomew Corrigan. The sound of his voice made Josephine's blood run cold. Wyatt remained silent, his rifle steady. "No? Playing coy?" Corrigan's voice lost its pleasant edge, replaced by a cold sneer. "Fine. We'll come in and get it. Boys, the door." Crash! A massive crash shook the entire cabin as a heavy log, used as a makeshift battering ram, slammed into the front door. The thick oak shuddered, but the bar held. Crash! A splintering sound this time. The wood was giving way. "Get ready," Wyatt breathed. Crash! The top hinge tore from the frame. The door sagged inwards, held only by the bar and the bottom hinge. Through the gap, Josephine could see the dark shapes of men. Wyatt didn't wait for them to break through. He leveled the rifle, aimed through the crack, and fired. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. A scream from outside answered it, followed by a string of curses. "He's in there!" another man shouted. "He's armed!" Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets tore through the thin cabin walls, splintering wood, shattering a jar on a shelf, kicking up dust from the floor. Josephine flattened herself against the wall, her head ringing, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling her nostrils. Wyatt was a phantom in the gloom, moving from one window to the next, firing methodically. He wasn't wasting shots. Each one was aimed, controlled. A cry from the side of the house suggested another bullet had found its mark. "He's just one man!" Corrigan roared, furious. "Get in there! The gold is inside!" The assault on the door redoubled. With a final groaning crack, the bar shattered and the door flew open. A large bearded man charged through the opening, a pistol in his hand. Time seemed to slow down. Josephine saw the man's face contorted in a snarl, his eyes wild. Wyatt was on the other side of the room, reloading. The man saw her, saw the vulnerable pregnant woman, and a cruel grin spread across his face as he raised his pistol. There was no time to think. Josephine raised the Colt just as Frank had shown her, both hands holding it steady. The bearded man's grin was the last thing she saw clearly before she pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the sound a physical blow. A red flower blossomed on the man's chest. His eyes went wide with surprise. He took a staggering step back and collapsed in the doorway, silent. The shock of what she'd done hit her like a physical blow. She had just killed a man, but there was no time for shock. Another figure was moving behind the first. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain shot through Josephine's side. She cried out, stumbling back, her hand flying to her ribs. It felt like a hot poker had been pressed against her skin. She'd been hit. Looking down, she saw a dark stain spreading across her dress. And then a second, more powerful pain seized her. A deep, primal contraction that radiated from her lower back, stealing her breath. Her water broke, a warm gush down her legs. The baby was coming. Now, in the middle of a gunfight. "Wyatt!" she cried out, a sound that was half pain, half terror. Wyatt turned, his face a pale mask in the moonlight. He saw the blood on her dress, the look on her face. His expression shifted from cold fury to raw panic. At that moment, a figure stepped over the body in the doorway. He was taller than the others, dressed in a black duster, his face narrow and intelligent, framed by silvering hair. It was Corrigan, his eyes cold and gray as a winter sky, flickered from the dead man on the floor, to Wyatt, to the gold chest, and finally to Josephine, crumpled against the wall. "Well, well," Corrigan said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "What a cozy little domestic scene. You've been busy, Wyatt. I thought I'd killed you." "You thought wrong," Wyatt snarled, leveling his rifle. "Give me the gold, Wyatt," Corrigan said calmly, raising his own pistol, "and I'll make her death quick. A mercy considering her condition." Another contraction ripped through Josephine, and she let out an involuntary moan, doubling over. Corrigan's smile widened. He saw his advantage, but in that split second of distraction, Wyatt acted. He didn't fire at Corrigan. He fired at the lantern hanging just above Corrigan's head, the one he had filled with oil earlier that day. The bullet shattered the glass. Oil rained down on Corrigan as the burning wick ignited it. With a roar, he was engulfed in flames. He screamed, a terrifying, inhuman sound, dropping his pistol and clawing at his burning clothes. He stumbled back out the doorway, a living torch, and collapsed into the yard, his screams fading into gurgling agony. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. The fight was over. The siege was broken. But Josephine's battle had just begun. Wyatt rushed to her side, his face etched with fear. "Josephine, you're hit. The baby!" she gasped, clutching his arm, her knuckles white. "It's coming now, Wyatt. The baby is coming." He looked from her blood-stained side to her face, contorted in the agony of childbirth. Outside, a man lay dead in his doorway, and another lay smoldering in his yard. Inside, amidst the chaos and the death, a new life was fighting its way into the world. Wyatt Cole, the ex-outlaw, the soldier, looked utterly, completely terrified. He had faced down the Corrigan gang. But this was a battle he had no idea how to fight. The world shrank to the four walls of the blood-spattered, bullet-riddled cabin. The stench of gunpowder and burnt cloth hung in the air, a hellish incense for the miracle unfolding within. For Wyatt, the chaos of the gunfight was a familiar terror. This was not. This was sacred and terrifying, a force of nature he was utterly unequipped to handle. Josephine was a warrior, gritting her teeth against the twin agonies of her gunshot wound and the relentless, crushing waves of labor. She guided him. "Water, clean cloths, Frank's knife. Boil it," she gasped out between contractions, her voice strained but clear. He moved on instinct, his soldiers' training to follow orders kicking in. He stoked the fire, boiled water, and tore strips from her last clean bedsheet. He cleaned her side wound as gently as he could. The bullet had torn a shallow gash along her ribs, painful, bloody, but by some miracle, it hadn't gone deep. Hours bled into one another. The moon climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent. Wyatt held her hand, wiped sweat from her brow, and murmured words of encouragement he didn't know he possessed. He saw a strength in her that dwarfed any gunman's bravado. She was fighting a battle far more profound than the one they had just survived, bringing life into a room still thick with the shadow of death. And then, just as the first pale gray light of dawn began to silhouette the eastern mountains, a new sound filled the cabin. Not a gunshot, not a scream of pain, but the thin, wailing cry of a newborn. Wyatt looked down, his hands trembling, at the small, wrinkled, red-faced infant Josephine held protectively to her chest. A boy. In the middle of the ashes of her old life, a new one had begun. Exhausted, Josephine managed a weak smile, her eyes shining with tears of relief and love. "A boy," she whispered. She looked at Wyatt, her gaze holding a universe of shared trauma and dawning hope. "Thank you, Wyatt." He could only nod, his throat thick with an emotion he couldn't name. The arrival of Sheriff Brody and a posse of 3 townsmen later that morning felt like an intrusion from another world. They'd been alerted by the rancher down the valley who'd heard the gunfire. They rode in expecting the worst, their guns drawn, and stopped dead at the scene. 2 bodies in the yard, 1 shot, 1 burned almost beyond recognition, and a third in the doorway of a cabin that looked like it had been at the center of a war. Brody entered the cabin cautiously, his eyes taking in the scene. Wyatt, looking haggard and blood-stained, but alive. Josephine, pale but lucid in her bed, a shallow bandage on her side, and the tiny sleeping infant nestled in her arms. "Mayhew," Brody began, his voice rough, then corrected himself, looking at Wyatt. "Cole, you want to tell me what in God's name happened here?" Wyatt didn't lie. Not completely. He told a streamlined version of the truth. "His name was Bartholomew Corrigan," Wyatt said, gesturing to the charred remains. "He and his men came for her. They killed her husband. They came back to finish the job and look for something he thought they had. We just defended ourselves." Brody looked at the chest of gold, which was still sitting in the middle of the room. It was the elephant in the cabin. He walked over and lifted the heavy lid. His eyes widened at the sight of the gleaming coins. He looked from the gold to Wyatt, then to Josephine and the baby. He was a pragmatic man, a man who understood the harsh calculus of the West. He let the lid fall with a dull thud. "Looks to me," the sheriff said slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, "like some outlaws came looking for trouble and found more than they bargained for. A clear case of self-defense." He turned to one of his deputies. "Get these bodies loaded onto a wagon. We'll bury them out on the flats. No names, no paperwork. Far as Redemption Gulch is concerned, this never happened." He then looked directly at Wyatt. "The past is a hard thing to outrun, son. Looks like you finally stopped running and turned to face it. Don't make me regret this." Wyatt met his gaze. "You won't, Sheriff." Brody gave a curt nod, his duty done. The law, in its own rough and tumble way, had sided with them. In the weeks that followed, a new routine settled over the ranch, a routine of healing. Wyatt's shoulder mended. Josephine's side healed, leaving a pale scar, and the ranch itself began to breathe again. The question of the gold remained. One evening, as Josephine rocked the baby by the fire, Wyatt brought it up. "It's blood money, Josie," he said quietly, using the familiar name without thinking. "Every coin in that chest is tainted." She looked from the sleeping face of her son to the iron-bound box. The gold was a ghost. It was the price of Frank's lies, the cause of his death, the reason she had almost lost her own life. "The Union Pacific," she said. "It was their money, wasn't it?" Wyatt nodded. "Then most of it should go back to them," she decided, her voice firm. "We can send it anonymously from another town." But she paused, looking around at the patched-up walls of the cabin, at the fields that needed plowing, at the future of the child in her arms. A man I once knew was said to have been killed in a cattle stampede. I reckon the ranch is owed something for that loss. A finder's fee, perhaps. Wyatt smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. It was the perfect solution, a cleansing of the soul that was also deeply practical. They kept $2,000, enough to hire proper hands, buy a new bull, and repair every broken piece of the ranch. The rest, packed in nondescript saddlebags, Wyatt took on a long journey to Cheyenne and left with a stunned but grateful railroad agent, along with an anonymous note of explanation. When he returned a month later, the ranch was already transformed. The fences were mended, the fields were plowed, and the sound of two new hired hands working in the distance was a sound of progress. He found Josephine on the porch, her son gurgling happily in a cradle beside her. She had named him Daniel, after her own father. There was no mention of Frank or Finn. That chapter was closed. Wyatt stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his hat in his hands, suddenly uncertain. His indenture was, by all moral rights, over. He was a free man. "The ranch is looking good," he said. "It is," she agreed, her eyes soft. "It's a good place to raise a boy." She patted the empty chair beside her. "Sit a while, Wyatt." He sat. They didn't speak of the future, of love, or of the promises people make to one another. There was no need. They had already forged a bond in the crucible of lies, gunfire, and birth. He was no longer the dollar man, and she was no longer the grieving widow. They were two survivors, scarred but whole, sitting on the porch of a home they had saved together. The sun set, casting a golden light over the land. It wasn't the gleam of stolen treasure, but the warm, honest glow of a new day, a new life, and a future that was finally their own to write. And so the story of Josephine Mayhew and Wyatt Cole reminds us that sometimes the deepest wounds aren't from bullets, but from lies. Their journey, forged in the violent heart of the Old West, shows that redemption isn't about forgetting the past, but about having the courage to build a new future from its ashes. A home isn't just built with logs and nails. It's built with grit, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds formed when two people have nothing left to trust but each other. If their incredible story of survival and second chances moved you, please help us share it with others. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share it with a friend who loves a powerful historical drama. Most importantly, if you want to hear more true tales and hidden histories from the American West, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We've got a lot more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.